As I continued my discussion with Nitin, it appeared that Nitin Srinivas Pandit is a truthful exemplification of an truthful attempt to live the legacy left by his parents Srinivas and Anjali, by his grandfather Damodar Pandit and great grandfather Gopal Pandit.
And then I came to the 90s, and that's when I stuck out and I set up my own company.
Few things just popped up to me. And I think
Mm.
it's very interesting that we take this moment and analyze what happened in your life at the artificial intelligence experiment, to put it. A, it was inquisitiveness, uh, but also it was a Gandhian rebelliousness. And I put it as a Gandhian rebelliousness that I'm sure you had a lot of questions. You questions of Nobel laureate, their premise, their hypothesis, but with a sense of humility in it. The other thing that I picked up is the courage to leave the comfort zone. But looking back, do you realize those things did happen?
Yeah, I mean the whole idea of sort of being driven and then sort of taking risk. Uh, yeah, I mean that was it was almost something that I couldn't control. Curiosity and just to some extent unbridled curiosity, you
Correct.
know, is needed if and that's what makes you take risks. And it's okay. Sometimes you will make a mistake, and it's okay. It's okay. It happens, and you can't you can't be afraid of that.
So
So
then you moved and established your own company. So how was that journey for you?
yeah. So when I got into this in '91, it was that same feeling. I want to do something, and remember this was when, as I said, you could see this whole idea about AI as being applied for problem solving when other things can't do it easily. This revolution was growing at that time. One on the AI side of it, and in parallel, and I guess these are birds of the same feather in some sense. Uh, Also in the area of economics and political science and so on. That's when Alfred North got his Nobel,
Mhm.
for and then brought up the idea that there is a difference between model building and storytelling, and both are important.
Hmm.
Engineers were not able to convince others and
Hmm.
still aren't, okay, because they're building these models. They're complex, they're wonderful models, they're fantastically useful, but to convince someone, you need to tell the story. And this is now coming around. Now you see the importance of storytelling as a major thing that National Geographic is doing, or other organizations like that are doing. So, but that realization that there is something more to it than building only mathematical models, and that was not the only rational way to look at it, that storytelling was also a very rational way to look at it, was the movement that was starting and was gathering momentum in the early 90s. So when I set up my own business, on one side, I was doing some really cool stuff. I had colleagues who had hired into the company and so on. They're now on their own and doing wonderfully well. But these were young guys who were just playing because they wanted to solve something. were interested in, tinkering and doing stuff and so on. But it was difficult because, as I said, we were a little ahead of time. I mean, the internet had just come to be. Okay. Right. So, and yet we did some absolutely trend-setting work. Okay, which conceptually, I would say, still can stand head-to-head, toe-to-toe with a lot of the work in AI for environmental problem solving. But the point is, it was a little ahead of time, so it was quite challenging to raise money to do that as a company. So again, it was a risk that I took, but a number of people did support through this process. It was there till the year 2000.
Yeah.
Okay, so I ran it for a good 9 years. I got we developed a patent out of it on climatological modeling using AI, okay, and things like that, which were quite a bit ahead of time, I feel, at that time, because we searched, but we didn't find any other stuff on it, really. Foundational stuff. So, but just the curiosity and the drive, kept it going. If it was to look at it, and a lot of people at that time who've set up now big companies and so on, they adapted themselves to the commercial realities, okay, and have established absolutely fantastic companies and so on to do that. I chose the path of just staying with what I liked and what I wanted to do. So from that perspective, I would say that, yeah, I'd managed pretty okay in that time. Could I have taken a path somewhere where, I would have only looked at the commercial success and said, let's just capitalize on that? I could have. I didn't. No regrets. But I mean, just a different path that I took, and the need to try and do something which was benefiting society, which was making science and technology's place known in society, and to bring it about in such a way that we could actually convince other people. Okay, that was the formative time for that. And right then, during that time, and by the way, all this on the side, I was also trying to finish my PhD.
Right. Yeah.
During this time. So I mean, it was pretty crazy. So anyway, but in that time, I ended up against another person who later on became the Nobel laureate, and that's Elinor Ostrom. And I became a fan, and I used to visit her and talk to her all the time. And I mean, that lady was just lovely. And it used to be that while Herb Simon was making his stuff known on the AI side for incomplete systems, who else better than Lynn to talk about institutions and storytelling and how, and be convincing about, things like that. So I was just very fortunate, and I pushed myself to get engaged, to learn from these people, because they had so much to tell. Another personality I came across were students of a fellow called H.T. Odum, Howard Odum.
Howard Odum, yes.
Not Eugene Odum, his brother.
Howard
Odum.
Yeah.
That book on systems ecology.
Yeah.
These three people in the US drove my thinking during this time.
Correct.
And I wanted to use it all to try and help someone like Mr. Date address some of the issues of the Narmada and so on and so on. So the attempt was, how can we? So once when Mr. Date came to stay with me, that's when the subject came up, and I asked him. I said, "Can you please write that book?" And ultimately, it led to Banking with Biomass, the book that he put together.
Okay.
But there was that. So I was running a business, doing some crazy things on AI applications, doing a PhD, and trying to keep up with these absolutely towering intellectuals. So it it was crazy, and running a family at the same time.
How was it to feel like doing PhD at a much later date compared to other normal students? Because,
Correct.
there is a stigma in scientific world
Mhm.
that if you finish masters and then you do not do your PhD in 5, 6, 7 years time, then you are not a scientific product or scientific temperament. And so how was it for you? Do you feel something like that?
No, that's a good point, Vishwas. You're right on the money on that one. It was not easy to enter at a later date, and yeah, absolutely, people would look at you and think, is this really serious or not? Yeah, yeah, a lot of it needed a lot of sort of just self-confidence and persuasion to try and make that happen, and to get the scientific community to actually, many times even the scientific community doesn't appreciate someone who comes in with experience, because that perhaps is a problem in the educational system. Even though the US does produce some amazing practical research out of their university labs, and some fabulous, probably some of the best in the world. But at the same time, there is that stigma, the pressure to not only publish, but a substantial amount of it is still driven by mediocrity.
Right.
And that's what it is. And for that mediocrity to accept other thoughts, other experiences, and was very difficult.
Yeah.
And so, but I found an advisor, Dr. Kingsley Haynes, who was a fabulous geographer, who then became my supervisor, and he worked with me on that. So I still love the man. So and it was great, to bring stuff together. At that time, the world of energy was changing.
Correct.
And then I got involved in this, bloody Enron thing, right? I mean, and so energy was like thing, and from the late 90s, then it set my path forward for the next 15 years. Because I had never really worked in energy before.
Okay.
I mean, an ancillary subject, but it was water, geology, soils, pollutants of all kind, that was remediation, things like that. But now, you look at the difference, and using AI to try and solve those. But now, you're seeing new ideas and techniques come out from institutions and political economy, from Lindström's work.
Right.
And so on. And these were huge influences, and how that impacts something that's happening in Enron. What does it mean? How does one think about it? These were thoughts that were going through my mind. And for a little while there, I was quite confused because there were too many things.
Right.
And I just couldn't put my hands around it. And so I decided in late 90s that, doing this and at the same time managing a company and growing it and so on, maybe I'm taking on too many things. And then I decided, okay, I want to try something different. And that I was being drawn towards sort of the application towards the social end of things.
Right.
And I decided that I would enter the non-profit sector. So after 20 years of working sort of the private and the consulting side, for the last 20 years now, I've been in the non-profit sector. So in 2000, there was an organization called the International Institute for Energy Conservation that needed a president to run their organization. And so I joined them, And I was there for 13 years, and I was working on energy for 13 years after.
Mm-hmm. So how was the energy scenario shifted or changed or shaped in those 13 years?
So I think some things happened in a sort of a natural way, primarily because during those very heady days, everything was fueled by fossil fuels, and there was a countervailing movement on climate
Mm-hmm.
that enabled to do that, and we were all very deeply involved in that, all the way to the Paris Convention in
Mm-hmm.
2050.
Mm-hmm.
So there was that dynamic, and it was being established, and big guys like whether it was Al Gore and group or the others, whoever,
Right.
they were involved in it. So that was one.
Mm-hmm.
But on the ground, and especially in developing countries, because in IIEC, the International Institute for Energy Conservation,
Mm-hmm.
mostly tasked to work in developing countries, which was actually very interesting to me,
Mm-hmm.
because my heart was still to try and look at development all throughout, right? I mean, while I was doing this with Mr. Date, so I was still very much involved in all these. So it was a calling, and it was important for me to get in. So IIC was a perfect place for it, because we had offices in Brazil, in South Africa, Philippines, Thailand, India, China, and the world of BRICS was just coming about, and so on. Energy in that space, therefore, was seeing growth on one side, which was all fossil fuel driven. But then the recognition that we need to do something about this, because even though people may deny it, I think in their hearts, they know that we can't keep up with this.
Right.
I mean, these guys are smart people. They can't be. I just don't believe. They may take a dogmatic approach or convince themselves that that what we're doing is right and so on. But inside, there's a little devil in there that's saying, "Nah, that's something messed up here."
That's also that's also something what I call as energy hypocrisy or energy mediocrity. That realize that certain things that you are propagating are not in tune with what it should be naturally happening, but you have compulsions and you just continue to bully
You
upon.
continue to go along. Yeah,
Yeah,
you become complacent, frankly, about that.
correct.
Okay. So then Mr. Datek told me, and I had met Girish Sant and people at that time, and was interacting with them. And IIEC was sort of it provided a great foundation to try out the experiment to look at efficient energy use. So the focus of IIEC was actually efficiency. Okay. And that too, the recognition, and this is where I sort of got in touch quite a bit with Amulya Reddy, who was at Indian Institute of Science,
Right.
who was Girish's supervisor.
Okay.
And Amulya, I mean, oh my God, I mean, unbelievable person. And the entire world of energy efficiency and that work over there with the Brazilian Jose Goldenberg and Reddy and so on. This was the foundational stone for looking at energy use in an efficient manner. And so for that entire dozen or so years, we actually got to practice that and come up with some fantastic innovations during that time. And some of them actually came to fruition. And I still look back very fondly on those. And especially in India.
All right.
So, for example, we worked with the government and the utilities and so on to launch programs which helped in actually scaling up of LED technologies in India. And look where LEDs are today.
Right. Yeah. Practically everywhere.
And so it was an approach where we looked at energy not from the supply side, but from the demand side. End use behavior so that the demand itself goes down and the suppliers damn well have to produce what the demand is asking for. So driven by the demand side energy efficiency, it's like saying what Amulya used to say is if you save 1 kilowatt hour or 1 unit at the end because of inefficiencies, it's like saving the production of 3 to 4 kilowatt hours at the
Right.
So it's much easier to invest on the demand side and get that. Now it's a difficult story to sell. And we went through many iterations of storytelling and so on. In some cases we succeeded, like the LED story.
Bilkul.
Changes end use behavior to change and include efficiency as the primary driver for it. And so we call this entire area market transformation. How do you transform the market from the bottom up, from the demand side, rather than saying, okay, here's just one more technology, aap ye karna chahiye, wo karna chahiye. Rather than saying that, how do you change behavior itself? The ideas on that and the institutions that need to be set up for that and so on, all that was going on across these multiple countries and amazing. And I came across some very, very good people during that time also to learn from. People like, again, he's not a professor, but by God, I mean, if he's not a professor, I don't know who would be. But one fellow called Dilip Limaye, he's settled in Philadelphia. Mr. Limaye is the father of energy efficiency implementation in terms of how to some of these ideas that Amulya and folks had, and how do you actually get it into practice? Okay, how do you actually get it done? There's so much to learn from Dilip that it was fascinating. So I learned a lot in this thing, and then I learned mainly about the demand side. And then I started seeing this behavioral economics and end use demand and so on. You could apply that in many commodities. You could apply that in water. You could apply that in many other goods and commodities. And I started thinking about that in the late 2000s and so on. And by the time I left IIEC, it was in 2013, those thoughts were getting very well formulated and so on. So that's when I IIEC. But I learned a lot about energy during that time.
So before we shift from 2013 to present, you had an opportunity to actually chair an institution that works in multicultural environment at multiple locations globally, and yet it is non-profit in that sense.
Correct. It was a non-profit, yes.
And charitable in many ways, How was it to manage that organization? What was the learnings?
Yeah. And starting from a point where I had never really been with a non-profit before.
Correct.
And when I joined, because I had already got 20 years of experience, I was immediately into sort of the head of the organization situation. And I must say, I was somewhat unprepared for that challenge. Because I didn't know how these institutions worked, how non-profit boards work as compared to private boards, and how do you raise money? How do you do nothing? But I jumped in. I said, there's no other way to learn swimming. Here it is. Here we go.
Right.
So I would say it was really plain the school of hard knocks. Okay. Very hard lessons. I had to put my own money at stake for a number of years. It was very hard to go through that time period. I mean, there were some really nice ups also. From all commercial senses, I would say that those 13 years, was a hard experience. But by doing that, I learned a lot. That's why it now comes somewhat effortlessly. That need to sort of keep on your toes, sort of trains you. It's like exercise. Hard, but it's good for you. So by then, see, Herb Simon had passed away. Mr. Date had passed away. And Lynn Ostrom had won the Nobel Prize. so a lot of things were happening. My children had gone to college, so I did have some freedom, as if I as if I never used it in the past. Manjusha would say so
Right.
as if that made a difference. So, but anyway, yeah, there was a little less of that go on. So at that time, I said, okay, I've been doing energy now for a long time. I understand water, I understand soils, and on, and I've played around with a lot of things. Now, I'd like to try and actually look at sort of addressing some policy related issues and development related issues.
Mm-hmm.
But always wanting, because of Mr. Date's mentorship, to try and see the impact on the ground. You can see the changes that are happening in our environment, which were disturbing.
Mm.
And I was doing this, anytime we came across an energy problem, and someone from the world of biodiversity would come in, or you would come across people who are talking about the Club of Rome and sort of the extinction, not only biodiversity, but also on the resources side of it. So someone like maybe Ashok Khosla would come in and say, we need to, what are we doing with our resources, right? He continues to say that for years. He continues to say that.
Mm-hmm.
I just sort of kept on feeling, and then I could see the difference in the Konkan strip where I'm from, or anywhere else I traveled in the world. You could see it. So I said, okay, it's time to maybe think about a slightly broader canvas that I play on and try and see what can be done there. And at the same time, WRI was looking for someone to be their first CEO in India. And so those 3 years I spent at WRI, and there were some established programs which WRI India does mainly on the urban side, like urban transport and so on. Whereas I wanted to look at development more on sort of the poor and the rural side. Primarily the poor, but specifically on the rural side, if I could do that. And so I started WRI's program in restoration of degraded lands. There was a global program in Washington, which was running across the world. So I reached on to that. And in those 3 years, we set up a very nice program, which is still running at WRI. It's a good program. And that overall global initiative is also a good initiative. Okay. But in that process, I learned a lot about this. And in restoration, then, you come across all these other things like water and soils and things like that. I mean, and with that, I was perfectly comfortable.
Mm-hmm.
I was picking up during those 3 years was, what about biodiversity? What is it? So I was reading and trying to understand and so on. And WRI was not a specialist in biodiversity.
Correct.
More onto it, more onto, sort of more programmatic stuff, more on resources. Whereas biodiversity was something else. I just couldn't get my handle on it for some time. And so I started reading and interacting with people and so on. And I felt that, I needed to do more and more in that. WRI saw that I was actually spending a lot more time on restoration rather than sort of looking at sort of the entire portfolio, which was of interest to WRI. Okay, come back to Washington.
Okay.
To help run the restoration program in this thing. So I did that for a year. And then I left. I became a grandfather. I mean, I spent 1 year. My daughter's name is Sanjana. During that time, a lot of changes happened, by the way, during these last 10 years. In 2010, my father passed away.
Okay.
2014, after I joined WRI, my mother passed away. So a lot of changes in my own personal life. But, the big thing was Manasi, my middle daughter, got married, and then we got Sanjana. And that just changed life completely again. So both myself and my wife, both of us gave up our jobs. We year, and I tell you, I think that's the best decision I've ever made. You're playing with a toy for 1 year, okay? A living toy. I mean, it's great. So yeah, I mean, that's absolutely
fantastic. भातुकलीच्या खेळामधली राजा आणि कर्ण. You live
right.
these, yeah.
It is great fun. Yeah. Year off, and that's when during that time, Karthik Shankar, who was then the director at ATREE, contacted me, and he said, "Hey, I heard that you left WRI and all that." Karthik moved in fairly quickly, and then immediately when I went back to DC, had Kamal come and meet me, and so it took me a year to sort of decide. But after that, I said, "Okay, ATREE is the best kept secret in India."
Correct me if I'm not right in my understanding. We all who are pro-resource people, whether it is a natural resource like plants or animals or energy resource or water resource, or even for that matter, a human resource.
Absolutely.
We are often not in sync with each other. We are often at loggerheads and in odds with each other. And that creates a lot of conflict in resource management and resource restoration as well. How does world needs to think through this process? And
that's a very good question, actually, and I think there is something that I think philosophically that nature has to teach us, and which is what attracts me towards biodiversity. And what people like Kamal and Uma Shankar and Ganesh and some of the other folks have to teach us. I mean, that's see the way in which nature finds its own balance, and it finds it in at all levels, from the microcosm all the way to scale. And you don't need to have a grand unified theory for it. But at each level, there is that concept of unity in diversity.
True.
And I don't think anyone has really captured that in terms of what it means and what to do with it. The idea of diversity as a mechanism for reconciling these conflicts and trade-offs is so embedded in the way in which things are. But what we still are not able to do, and I think that's an area of intellectual curiosity for me, is that yes, we know it exists, we can't actually quantify it as easily.
Right.
But we know it exists. How does that inform us to say not only how it exists and what it was, but what it ought to be? And that what it ought to be is something where there's a need for scientists to actually get a little bit of that engineering thinking in there. I keep on saying, as scientists, we want to find the laws, we want to discover things, and that's great. We need that. That's your basis of your knowledge. Okay, but you must position it at some point in time so that you can move forward and try to resolve problems and issues. And that contextualization often doesn't happen. Now, on the engineering side of it, what again Mr. Date also used to say is that engineers never ask, they're told to do a job and they'll do it in the best way possible. They'll do a brilliant job.
Mm.
but they never ask why and for whom. There are issues on both sides.
Mm.
But the good part of it is, how does one sort of bring this about so that we can use what we know to be the one science that helps in bringing diversity and differences together into a unity?
Mm.
Okay. How do we use that to actually help us in deciding where we ought to be going?
Mm.
Because otherwise the science or the social sciences and economics and psychology and political science and so on, I still feel that they haven't really addressed the issues. Every time it comes back to asking a dogmatic question: are you on the left or are you right, or are you doing this or that? What is the framing of your question? I find that doesn't necessarily resolve the problem. It doesn't change minds.
Mm-hmm. That your arrival on the biodiversity scene in India is at a pretty peculiar crossroads. How do you then, piggybacking on your experience as an artificial intelligence man to an entrepreneur running his own company, then getting into the resource restoration as well as utilization world, see that we as a nation needs to look at biodiversity, and biodiversity is science per se, or rather I would say biodiversity entrepreneurship.
One of the lessons is that we have not learned to communicate. To bring about change of behavior, okay, it requires that you try to understand, appreciate, and work with the motivations and the ways of other people. Not that you have to be unprincipled about it, not at all. In fact, not so.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, it's important to be able to persuade and to show that this has meaning, that this can help us. And I think the tradition so far, again, coming in from the outside as to the biodiversity world,
Mm-hmm.
I think that our messaging is not attractive. When you ask us from the biodiversity side, we are always into sort of the holistic. Okay. Now, holistic thinking is good, but it has to be translated into prescriptions that people can appreciate.
Mm.
What I feel we need to do, I mean, we know a lot, but to distill that into things that can be put up as alternatives to the otherwise destructive way of doing things
Mm.
is art that we just haven't learned. And we are way behind on this. We're way behind.
Mm.
I mean, some of the most advanced folks in this area in messaging and so on, say like National Geographic and so on,
Mm.
okay, even their messaging, okay, is only at the political level and at the level of the urban intelligentsia.
Mm.
Okay, it it still, has not come into the vernacular.
Mm.
There's a lot to learn, and with the tools and things becoming much more available, I think in India, in a place like ATREE and some of our other partner institutions, we actually may have an opportunity to leapfrog that,
Mm.
to avoid some of these things that are coming up where these conflicts and trade-offs can't otherwise be managed.
Mm-hmm.
We don't have a story to tell yet. In order to make that impact at a societal level, we must understand, appreciate the need for communication.
Every life we live on this planet Earth, we have a bag of experiences. And every time we have an experience, we have lessons to learn. What are few key lessons that you learned and you would definitely would like to share with people who would like to jump into your suit?
First, at a personal level, I've spoken. I mean, I think humility
Hmm.
is the first criteria. There is you if you don't have humility, you won't listen, you won't learn. You must understand uh, what you can do and what your own limitations are, and you must appreciate others for what they do. I mean, at a professional level, you sort of said it in a way. You have to be able to leave your comfort zone,
Hmm.
and if that doesn't excite you, because there's a thrill to it, you're sort of out there, you're vulnerable, but you can't be afraid of that. I have felt and continue to feel vulnerable at many times.
And continue to
And
fail as well.
yes, absolutely. Vulnerability is a part of life.
Hmm.
Therefore, risk is a part of life. Since risk and vulnerability are a part of life, you know, learn to manage them and revel in what they bring to you,
Hmm.
rather than try to build walls and protect yourself against them. It's fun to deal with the uncertainties of life.
My takeaway from what I have enjoyed listening to you so far is that if you want to be a truly an researcher or a scientist or an entrepreneur, or even to work for that matter in a non-profiting NGO sector, you have to put aside your ego.
Absolutely.
And then you have to expose yourself, the truest side of you, what you truly believe and what you truly feel should happen.
You're absolutely right. Now, for example, okay, now I play tennis, I like to swim and so on. But, I do like to have that kind of physical movement and activity.
Hmm.
Okay, some the other, it doesn't have to be the same. In fact, the more different, the better.
True.
Um, the best form of meditation that I've ever tried is when I'm swimming, because you're breathing
Hmm.
this, and it is probably one of the most peaceful times.
Hmm.
Okay. So movement and synchronicity in that and so on is really very cool. So I enjoy that. Uh, I do try things which don't come easily. So, for example, I tried to learn a ukulele and I broke it.
Uh-huh.
So the second thing I like to do is sometimes I like to write some offbeat pieces,
Hmm.
small pieces that are, and they are typically a mixture of some thought,
Mm.
but placed in a very different sense. So recently I wrote up a piece which then Kamal forwarded to ecology, economy, and society. Sometimes listen to poetry. I like to listen to music. So outreach is a big component of what I do,
Hmm.
and not all scholastic, but in every way, shape, and form.
Hmm.
Just like to out. It has to be more outward. So
And
it keeps very busy. I've had no time during this time of Corona. People say they're bored and all that. I can't find the time. I'm so in the morning when I take a shower, I I typically sing the Pasaidan. I mean
uh-huh.
I enjoy that. I think it has guided me and quite a bit and continues to and probably.
Each time I sit down for conversation with Nitin, our conversations can prolong for hours together. Simply because Nitin is an amazing and wonderful storyteller. And every storyteller has set of poems under his sleeves. We concluded our conversation with one of the childhood poem that Nitin recited, which actually exemplifies the beauty of nature and significance of nature in our life.
देवा तुझे किती सुंदर आकाश, देवा तुझे किती सुंदर आकाश, सुंदर प्रकाश सूर्य देतो, सूर्य देतो, सुंदर चांदण्या चंद्र हा सुंदर, चांदणे सुंदर पडे त्याचे, पडे त्याचे, सुंदर ती झाडे सुंदर पाखरे, किती गोड बरे गाणे गाती, गाणे गाती, सुंदर त्या वेली सुंदर ती फुले, किती गोड मुले देवा तुझी, देवा तुझी, इतुके सुंदर जग तुझे जर, किती तू सुंदर असशील, असशील, किती तू सुंदर असशील, असशील.